It started with a mistake, one that should have never happened. One that, in the moment, felt completely natural. Because how could he have known? How could anyone have known? He woke up to the sound of soft breathing beside him, the warmth of a familiar body curled against his own. For a fleeting second, everything felt right. Normal. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the dim morning light, something felt off. The scent was the same, the touch was the same, but there was a slight difference in the way her fingers rested on his chest. A subtle shift in the rhythm of her breathing. And then he saw her face. His blood ran cold. The woman lying next to him wasn't his wife. She looked like her, exactly like her, but something in her expression told him the truth before she even spoke. A half-smile played on her lips, but there was hesitation behind it. Guilt. Fear. His stomach twisted. His mind raced. How did this happen? Had it been a cruel joke? A misunderstanding? Or was it something far, far worse? He wanted to believe there was an explanation, a way to fix what had just shattered in front of him. But the moment she whispered his name, his real name, not the way his wife said it, but softer, slower, laced with something unspoken, he knew. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't some bizarre prank. It was real. And now, he was trapped in a nightmare he could never escape. Because the woman beside him wasn't just anyone. She was his wife's twin sister. And the secret they now shared. It could ruin everything. What would he do? Would he confess? Would she? Or was this just the beginning of something even darker? John had always considered himself a lucky man. Not in the reckless, gambling sort of way, but in the quiet, steady kind of luck that made a man feel at peace with his life. He had worked hard, built a career he was proud of, and somehow, in a world full of uncertainty, had found the one person who made everything feel right. Sarah. She was the love of his life, the woman who had walked into his world 10 years ago and never left. They met in college, one of those chance encounters that felt scripted by fate. He had spilled coffee on her notebook in the library, stammered out a clumsy apology, and she had laughed instead of scowled. That was Sarah. Always seeing the humor in things, always making him feel like his imperfections were just part of what made him lovable. Their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was strong. They had their ups and downs like anyone else, but at the end of the day, John never doubted what they had. She was his best friend, his partner in everything. They had inside jokes, late-night talks that stretched into the early hours, and a deep, unspoken understanding of each other. John was the kind of man who appreciated routine. He liked the comfort of predictability, the way Sarah's perfume lingered on their pillows, the way she hummed to herself while cooking dinner, the way she always stole the blankets at night but made up for it by curling into his arms in the morning. These were the little things that made up his world, the things he never questioned because they had always been there. If someone had asked him if he was happy, he would have answered without hesitation. Yes. Of course. How could he not be? He had everything he had ever wanted: a loving wife, a stable life, a future that felt safe and secure. But sometimes, life doesn't ask for permission before it changes everything. Sometimes, a single moment, one small, careless mistake is all it takes to unravel everything you thought was unshakable. John didn't know it yet, but his perfect life was about to fall apart. And the worst part? It would be entirely his fault. Sarah had kissed him goodbye that morning with a lingering softness, her fingers brushing through his hair as she whispered, "I'll call you when I land." John had smiled, promising to miss her even though it was just a short trip. They had been through this routine before she traveled for work now and then, and he held down the fort until she returned. It never felt like a big deal. That night, as he sat alone in their quiet house, the silence felt heavier than usual. He had made dinner for one, watched half a movie he wasn't really interested in, and considered going to bed early. But then his phone buzzed. It was Emily. "Emily, hey, I was in the neighborhood. Thought I'd drop by if you're up for some company." John hesitated for a moment before replying. He hadn't seen Emily in a while. Sarah's twin sister had always been more of a free spirit, constantly moving from one place to another, never quite settling down. She and Sarah were identical in looks but worlds apart in personality. Where Sarah was grounded, Emily was unpredictable. Still, they had always gotten along, and he saw her as family. "John, yeah, sure. Come over. I could use the company." 15 minutes later, Emily arrived, stepping inside with that effortless energy she always carried. She looked exactly like Sarah, down to the way she tucked her hair behind her ear, but there was something in the way she moved looser, more casual. She tossed her bag onto the couch, grinning as she pulled off her jacket. "You looked like you were dying of boredom," she teased. John chuckled, heading to the kitchen. "Guilty. Want a drink?" "Always." They settled in the living room with glasses of wine, conversation flowing easily. Emily told stories about her latest adventures, her job, the places she'd been, the people she'd met. John laughed more than he had in days. She had a way of making everything feel light, uncomplicated. One drink turned into two. Two turned into three. The air between them shifted, just slightly, but John didn't notice. Maybe it was the way Emily leaned in when she laughed, or the way her fingers brushed against his arm absent-mindedly. Maybe it was just the wine dulling his better judgment. The hours slipped by. At some point, Emily stretched her legs out on the couch, her head resting against the armrest as she sighed. "I forgot how nice it is here," she murmured. "Feels like home." John smiled. "It is home." Emily turned her head to look at him, her expression soft. "You and Sarah are lucky, you know. What you have, it's rare." Something in her voice made him pause. He should have stood up then, should have called it a night. But he didn't. Instead, he reached for the bottle, pouring one last glass for each of them. What happened next didn't feel planned. It didn't even feel real. Maybe it was the drinks. Maybe it was the familiarity. Maybe it was the fact that, for a brief moment, his mind blurred the line between the woman in front of him and the one he loved. Emily leaned in. So did he. A touch. A kiss. A mistake that neither of them stopped. The night passed in a haze, and when John finally drifted into sleep, his mind was too clouded to process what had just happened. It wasn't until the morning light crept through the curtains that reality crashed down on him. The warmth beside him. The scent. The body curled against his own. His breath caught in his throat as his eyes flickered open. It wasn't Sarah. His heart pounded, nausea twisting in his gut. Emily stirred beside him, her eyes fluttering open with a sleepy, knowing look. John felt like he was drowning. How had this happened? What had he done? John woke with a pounding headache and a hollow feeling in his chest. The warmth beside him felt wrong, suffocating. His pulse drummed in his ears as he turned his head, dread settling in his bones before his eyes even confirmed it. Emily. She lay beside him, tangled in the sheets, her bare shoulder exposed to the soft morning light filtering through the curtains. She wasn't looking at him, not yet, but she was awake. He could tell by the way her breathing had changed, by the slight tension in her body. She was waiting for him to react. His throat was dry, his mind racing to piece together the fragments of the night before. The wine. The laughter. The way her touch had felt familiar, dangerously familiar. He had blurred the lines. He had let himself forget, just for a moment, who she was. Who he was. Panic clawed at his chest. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He sat up too quickly, his head spinning, the weight of what he had done slamming into him all at once. His hands trembled as he dragged them over his face, as if he could wipe away the night, erase the mistake before it solidified into something undeniable. Emily shifted beside him. "John," she murmured, her voice softer than he expected. Almost pleased. He couldn't look at her. He couldn't face what he had done. This, his voice cracked. This shouldn't have happened. She let out a slow breath, sitting up beside him, the sheets pooling around her. But it did. He turned to her then, searching her face for something regret, shame, anything that mirrored the storm raging inside him. But Emily didn't look guilty. She looked calm. "You knew," he whispered, horror creeping into his voice. "You knew I thought you were Sarah." She tilted her head, eyes unreadable. "Did you?" His stomach twisted. "Of course I did." He ran a hand through his hair, his skin clammy with cold sweat. "I wouldn't have." "Wouldn't have what?" Emily cut in, her tone measured. "Wouldn't have touched me. Wouldn't have kissed me. Wouldn't have wanted me if you weren't convinced I was her." John stared at her, his breath shallow. "Because from where I was sitting," she continued, her voice soft but edged with something dangerous. "You knew exactly who I was." "No," he said sharply, shaking his head. "That's not true." Emily sighed, standing and gathering her clothes with an unhurried ease. "You can lie to yourself if you want," she said, pulling her shirt over her head. "But we both know last night happened for a reason." John shot up from the bed, hands clenched. "It was a mistake." Emily smiled, a slow, knowing smile that sent a chill down his spine. "If that's what helps you sleep at night." He wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but his own memories betrayed him. He had leaned in first. He had let it happen. Maybe it had been the alcohol, maybe it had been the loneliness, maybe it had been the cruel trick of her face, so identical to Sarah's. But deep down, none of that mattered. Because the truth was simple. He had betrayed his wife. And now, he was trapped. As Emily slipped on her shoes, she glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Don't worry," she said lightly. "Your secret's safe with me." John swallowed hard. He didn't believe her. Not for a second. As she walked to the door, she paused, turning back with a smirk that sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. "See you around, John." And then she was gone. John stood in the silence of the room, his heart pounding, his skin crawling with the weight of what he had done. There was no undoing this. No erasing the night. And worst of all, no way of knowing what Emily would do next. John had never been a good liar. That was the first thing he realized in the days following that night with Emily. He had always prided himself on being honest, on being the kind of man Sarah never had to second-guess. But now, every time he looked at her, every time she smiled at him with the same effortless trust she always had, his stomach twisted with guilt. At first, he thought he could hide it. He told himself it was just a moment of weakness, a mistake that would never happen again. But guilt had a way of settling into a man's bones, weighing him down in ways he hadn't anticipated. It started small. He found himself avoiding her touch not because he didn't want her, but because every time her hand brushed against his, he felt Emily's instead. The memory of that night clung to him like a stain he couldn't wash away. Sarah noticed. She didn't say anything at first, but he could see the confusion in her eyes when he pulled away too soon or when his responses to her affection felt forced. She would tilt her head, studying him, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that shouldn't exist. "Are you okay?" she asked one night as they lay in bed. Her fingers traced lazy circles on his arm, a habit that used to soothe him. Now it made his skin crawl. "Yeah," he said too quickly. "Just tired." A pause. Then a soft sigh. "You've been distant lately." His heart pounded. "Work's been stressful." Another lie. He felt her hesitation, but after a moment, she let it go, nestling into his side. John stared at the ceiling, feeling like the worst kind of man. It only got worse from there. He started working late when he didn't have to. He lingered in the shower longer than usual, hoping the scalding water would somehow cleanse him of his sins. He couldn't look her in the eye when she talked about Emily, when she casually mentioned something her sister had done or said. Every time Sarah's phone buzzed, he tensed, afraid it would be Emily, afraid she would say something that would bring his world crashing down. His mind became a battlefield of paranoia and self-loathing. What if Emily told her? What if she let something slip, just enough for Sarah to start asking the right questions? Would she believe him if he lied? Could he even bring himself to lie to her face? He had never cheated before. Never even considered it. The thought of being that kind of man had always disgusted him. And yet, here he was, drowning in his own betrayal, waiting for the inevitable moment when Sarah would see him for what he really was. It finally happened one evening over dinner. Sarah had been watching him all night, quiet but observant. John tried to act normal, but the weight of her stare made his food taste like ash. He barely touched his plate. Then, without warning, she spoke. "John," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "Are you cheating on me?" The fork in his hand slipped, clattering against the plate. His pulse roared in his ears. "What?" He forced out a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Of course not. Why would you even ask that?" Her expression didn't change. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But she was searching him, peeling back the layers of his guilt with every second of silence that passed. "You've been different," she said. distant, cold. You barely touch me anymore, and when you do, it feels like you're somewhere else. John swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table as if it could anchor him. You're imagining things, he said, but even he didn't believe himself. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. Am I? He could see it now, the beginning of the end. The unraveling of everything he had spent years building. And the worst part? He deserved it. John barely recognized his own life anymore. Days blurred together in a suffocating haze of guilt, fear, and paranoia. He had thought he could bury the truth, push it down deep enough that it would never surface, but the weight of it had seeped into every corner of his existence. Sarah knew something was wrong. She could feel it in the way he avoided her touch, in the way he barely spoke unless spoken to. She had stopped asking if he was okay. Now, she just watched him, her silence heavier than any accusation. And then there was Emily. She wasn't just a mistake from one drunken night anymore. She was a shadow looming over his marriage, a presence that refused to fade. She sent cryptic texts at odd hours, always just subtle enough to be dismissed as innocent if Sarah happened to see them. She would call, let the phone ring just long enough to make his pulse spike, then hang up before he could answer. And when they saw each other in person, she would look at him just a little too long, smirk just a little too knowingly. At first, John had begged her to let it go. He had called her the morning after, his voice shaking as he told her what happened could never happen again. She had only laughed. Relax, John. Your secret's safe with me. But now, he wasn't so sure. One evening, after yet another tense, silent dinner with Sarah, John retreated to the bathroom, locking the door behind him. He turned on the sink, splashing cold water on his face, gripping the edge of the counter as he stared at his reflection. He looked exhausted. Haunted. His phone buzzed. Emily. Emily, we should talk. I miss you. John's stomach turned. He started typing a response, then stopped. Anything he said would only make things worse. He deleted the message and set the phone down. When he came out of the bathroom, Sarah was standing in the hallway. She was holding his phone. Who's Emily? She asked. John's blood ran cold. She's your sister, he said too quickly, reaching for the phone, but Sarah pulled it away. Then why is she texting you that she misses you? His mouth opened, but no words came out. He could see it now the moment she knew, deep down, that something was very wrong. She hadn't put the pieces together yet, but she was close. Sarah, it's not what you think, he said, his voice tight. Then explain it, she snapped, stepping closer. Because for weeks now, you've been acting like a stranger. You don't talk to me, you don't touch me, you barely even look at me, and now Emily is sending you texts like this. Her voice cracked on the last word, her anger barely masking the hurt. John wanted to fix it. He wanted to tell her something, anything that would make this nightmare go away. But there was nothing he could say. Nothing that would undo what he had done. Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through his messages, her breath hitching as she read the ones he hadn't deleted fast enough. You're sleeping with her, she whispered. John's heart pounded. Sarah. She looked up at him then, and the betrayal in her eyes was worse than any punishment he could have imagined. She shoved the phone into his chest, shaking her head. I want the truth, John. Tell me right now. Are you sleeping with my sister? The room felt like it was closing in on him. He had two choices. Or destroy everything. But before he could speak, the front door opened. Emily. She walked in as if she owned the place, her expression unreadable. She looked at Sarah, then at John, then at the phone clutched in his hands. And then she smiled. Guess he didn't delete everything, huh? Sarah turned to Emily, eyes wild with disbelief. Tell me she's lying, she demanded. Tell me this isn't happening. Emily tilted her head. Would that make you feel better? Sarah's breath hitched. Oh my God, she whispered. It's true. John felt his world collapse. Sarah let out a sharp, broken laugh, covering her mouth with a shaking hand. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I need you to leave, she said, her voice eerily calm. John stepped forward. Sarah, please. Not you. Her eyes locked onto Emily. You. Emily let out a soft sigh, shrugging as she grabbed her purse. But before she left, she leaned in just enough for only John to hear. "You should have chosen me," she whispered, and then she was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood there, arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to hold herself together. When she finally looked at him again, it wasn't with anger. It was worse. It was with finality. "I don't even know who you are anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. John had lost her. And he had no one to blame but himself. John never thought his life would come to this. He had spent years building something real, something strong, only to watch it crumble in a matter of moments. One mistake, one lapse in judgment, and now everything he once held dear was slipping through his fingers. Sarah had always been his anchor, his home. But when he looked into her eyes now, all he saw was someone who no longer recognized him. The trust they had, the love they built, it was shattered. Could something so broken ever be repaired? And then there was Emily. Had she planned this all along? Was this a mistake that spiraled out of control, or had he been caught in something far more dangerous than he realized? No matter how he tried to rationalize it, one thing was clear: his choices had led him here. So now the question remains, does John have any chance of saving his marriage, or is it already too late? What do you think? Could you ever forgive a betrayal like this? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and share if this story had you on edge. Because at the end of the day, one bad decision can destroy everything.